This episode of the podcast is dedicated לזכר ולעילוי נשמת Rav Yehuda ben Avraham Simcha ZT'L, Rav Yehuda Copperman, by a pair of his Talmidim in London who learned his masterpiece, Pshuto Shel Mikra, together. Rav Nechemya Sheinfeld, who is the מחבר of the Chomsh das Ezra, the commentary on Ibn Ezra, and has previously been interviewed on the podcast, and Moshe Dovid Spitzer, in grateful appreciation of all he gained from having the huge Zechus to learn bechavrusa, the Rav Copperman, or Copperman, also dedicated in honor and appreciation of the interviewee of this podcast, Rav Immanuel Bernstein, Talmid mubhak of Rav Copperman. This episode is also sponsored in honor of restarting Sefer Bereshis by Rabbi David Asher, Rabbi of Knesset Beth Israel, the OU Shul in Richmond, Virginia, and author of Outreach in the Torah by Mosaic Press, a week-by-week analysis of how every Sedra sends a message on the importance of reaching out to our fellow Jews. This Sefer is perfect for short Shabbos table Divrei Torah that are based on Rishonim with other classic Mefarshim, reminding us how the regular opportunities to connect all Jews to our Messiah are some of the most important responsibilities we have in our lifetimes. This Sefer includes askamas from Rav David Cohen, Rav Michal Rosenzweig, the Boston Rebbe in Brookline, Rav Azariah Berzin, Rav Yonah Rees, Rav Baruch Simon, Rav Shimon Isaacson, and Rabbi Akiva Kolchin of Kiryas Sefer. You can purchase this Sefer at the link that will be in the show's notes below. And again, it's titled Outreach in the Torah and published by Mosaic Press. If anyone would like to sponsor an episode of the podcast, which is $360, or to just support the podcast for any monetary sum, even less than that, which I very much appreciate, and there are those that have done so, you can use the link in the show's notes via PayPal, or you can do Chase QuickPay /Zelle at the email address seforumchatter@gmail.com. You can also email me seforumchatter@gmail.com for any other way that you would like to. Again, I very much appreciate all the sponsors, all those that have helped out. Now, there's music intro, there's improved audio, especially here in the introduction. The podcasts are still being phased out to old recordings, so slowly now I have new software, new microphone, new things. It'll be getting better. I'm looking into other softwares, other things, so if you have other feedback and other comments, you can email me. And also, again, the support, the monetary support goes a long way towards that, towards helping improve, and if there's anything that you think can be improved upon. If you can subscribe to the podcast, wherever you listen, 24/6, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever else. And also, if you use Apple, if you can rate and review the podcast. And for those that have, thank you. And if you haven't, it really helps the podcast. So if you can do that, definitely rate, and if you can leave a short review, I appreciate it as well. One note on this episode specifically, I mentioned throughout the podcast we discussed the Pshuto Shel Mikra of Rav Copperman, and there's a 3-volume Hebrew that we discussed a lot. There's a 2-volume English. There's a shorter version of the Hebrew. I do have the links and the information on how to order it. I'll put that in the show's notes. I mentioned this in the podcast. Rav Bernstein did send that information to me, so it will be in the show's notes if you're interested in purchasing it. So you can check it out there in the show's notes and enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Seforim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rav Immanuel Bernstein, who is a Maggid Shir in Yeshivas Machon Yaakov and teaches in various seminaries in Yerushalayim, including Michlala, which we'll discuss, as well as he is the Mechaber Seforim of a number of Seforim, including one that he basically was Mechaber / editor of, which we'll be really discussing, is an adaptation into English of the Pshuto Shel Mikra of Rav Yehuda Copperman, Rav Yehuda Copperman, but I guess you can go with both pronunciations. So the Pshuto Shel Mikra, this is not related to the Chomsh Pshuto Shel Mikra of recent fame or infamy, but this is a Sefer, 2 volumes together with a 3rd volume, the 3rd volume is titled Mavli Limud Torah, but the 2 volumes are Pshuto Shel Mikra from Rav Copperman, and Rav Copperman was the founder and the head of Michlala seminary. Also, he was very famous in the yeshiva world for his massive Meshech Chochmah and his edition of the Meshech Chochmah, Meir Simcha Vizvinsk. He also did an edition of Sfarno and a number of other things. But this is really his Pshuto Shel Mikra, his Mahalach. We'll talk about it here a little bit. So thank you, Rav Bernstein, for joining me.
Pleasure.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so briefly, I was born and raised in London. That's where I was for most of my childhood, with the exception of 4 years where actually my father was a rabbi in New York, in the Upper West Side, in a shul called the Jewish Center, if you've heard of that shul, West 86th Street. So those were 4 New York years, but aside from those, London till finishing high school, after which I came to Eretz Yisrael and have basically stayed ever since. So with regards to yeshiva, so I learned in yeshiva Eretz Yisrael, which is under Rav Mordechai Ezrahi, Shlita, for a number of years. Then was in Kollel for a few years, and then started teaching. My first teaching post was actually in a terrace. I went back to teach the Chutznikim there for a few years. And since then, I'd say for the last 17, 18 years, I've been teaching in yeshiva-wise in this yeshiva Machon Yaakov, which is a yeshiva for Balei Shuva. It's like a sister yeshiva to Machon Shlomo, Rav Yehuda Copperman. If the name is familiar, I assume and hope that it is. And aside from that, teaching various seminaries, Michlala, of course, Rav Copperman seminary, a couple of Beis Yaakov seminaries also. And I've been involved a lot in writing Seforim over the last 10 years, which we might discuss a little bit, I guess, towards the end. And that is basically me. I live in Bayat Began, and here I am.
Right, so your Seforim, as you mentioned, we'll discuss a little bit at the end, but that really, Mirza Hashem will do another podcast episode about your Seforim, but this one really about Rav Copperman / Copperman. But
Lovely.
Let's talk about him and your shaykhs to him, to Rav Copperman. What is your connection? What's your relation to him?
So my relationship with Rav Copperman or Copperman, again, both are correct. Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chaim. The original name was Copperman actually, and for some reason Israelis gravitated towards Copperman, and that's kind of how it remains. So Israelis will call him Rav Copperman, the Chutznikim one or the other. He answered to both, never made a thing of it. It's the same person. And I myself interchange them, so that's only to give chizuk to both practices. So Rav Copperman and I'm actually family with him. In his mother and my grandmother, my father's mother, were sisters, and they were very close for the reason that they all grew up in the shtetl near Bialystok. It's called Yeshanovka, and some of them made it out before the war. Some of them did not leave before the war, and they were all killed, murdered. And of those that made it out, so a couple went to America, one went to South Africa, and 2 sisters went to Dublin, Ireland. And they are Rav Copperman's mother and my grandmother. And in fact, Rav Copperman's mother brought my grandmother out. So we owe them everything, really, the Bernsteins, the Coppermans, everything. So you had these 2 Polish sisters, recent immigrants to Ireland, and they lived around the corner from each other. The families were like enmeshed with each other, always in and out of each other's houses, and they were kind of together until Mrs. Copperman moved to Israel, and all of her children moved to Israel. All of them made Aliyah, so that's the original family connection. So my connection personally with Rav Copperman begins with my father. My father, Rabbi Isaac Bernstein ZT'L, you may have heard of him through, he had a famous Chomsh here in Hendon, in the Ner Yisrael shul there, aside from other things. They were first cousins. Now, my father was a good deal younger than Rav Copperman. It's like 10 years younger. But somehow they had a connection which was very, very special. They really saw eye to eye. To behold the 2 of them when they got together, which they did on occasion, they shared a love of Chomsh. They shared like this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of Mefarshim, Rishonim, and Achronim. They almost used to talk in code as they would discuss things, because they would just really mention the name of the author and the pasuk, and it was understood what he said and how that contributed to the discussion. So it was a little bit difficult to follow, admittedly, at times, but it was amazing to witness. And they remained very, very close. And my father passed away in the mid-90s. But what this meant for me, aside from other things, is that I had a niche waiting for me when I came to yeshiva, which is now getting on for over 30 years ago. So I immediately started a bechavrusa with Rav Copperman once a week, and that bechavrusa went on for about 25 years. And that has to be, as I'm told, it's one of the most long-standing bechavrusas with Rav Copperman, although he had many, many bechavrusas. And so, aside from the fact that he became like a father figure for me, during those kind of later years, he was just an enormous influence, because meeting with him once a week, and when you learn with him, whatever text we were learning, whatever sefer we were learning, and we learned through many things, it was often a springboard for discussions of all sorts of things, like education, women's education specifically, Torah in general. So I got to absorb on a weekly basis a great deal, and it made a big impact on me. And I came to regard him as one of my main rebbeim, not just in Chumash, but in life generally, because he kind of had a way of looking at things, which was just incredible. He had this vast perspective, incredible knowledge, and it was unpredictable sometimes, which is also very interesting. And that was our connection.
So I want to talk more about him. I just want to ask you briefly. So did you have any connection to Ireland? There's a little Irish in your accent, maybe some listeners here, but did you have any connection there, or your family was already in England?
So my parents were both Irish. I mean, all the Coppermans and the Bernsteins grew up together. My older brother and sister are Irish. I'm the first one of my family to be born in London. My father took a position in Hampstead Garden suburb, a shul called Norrisleen. So I'm almost Irish, which is a very Irish thing to be anyway. It is true. People have told me that my accent sounds Irish. It's only because it was originally English due to my upbringing, and then it became brutalized, more or less, by being exposed to Israeli speaking English and American speaking English. Pardon me. And so I think it retreated to some type of safe place. And I think that's the Irish roots that you hear coming through sometimes.
Yeah, I guess your parents are Irish. Your sibling, like you said, growing up not Irish. Okay, so let's talk about Rav Copperman. We'll call him, who was Irish, and let's talk a little bit about his biography. You know, you spoke a little bit connected. You spoke a little about him. Just talk a little bit more about him and his, upbringing, his rebbe, and where, what his was, and also, you mentioned the women's education. Obviously, he founded Michlala, the seminary, and as well as, as mentioned, everybody in the yeshiva world still today uses Meshech Chochmah and his other Seforim. So he's a very famous figure, even though listeners may just be familiar with Meshech Chochmah, they may not know his biography. So I think it's worth discussing. They would just be familiar with his works.
Sure. So briefly, just to get like an outline or a picture about Rav Copperman. So he was born in Ireland in 1929. He was born on the 28th of Iyar, which you may know as Yom Yerushalayim. He was very happy for that coincidence when it occurred. And he was one of 6 children, 5 boys, 1 girl. And their father passed away when they were very young. He was maybe bar mitzvah, I don't recall, but the oldest was 14 years old. The youngest, I think, was 2 years old. And it was the mother left alone with 6 kids. And she brought them up by herself. That was an amazing thing. And the oldest brother, Gershon, who is actually still alive and recently celebrated his 97th birthday, left school, and he brought them all up. He became the parents of the family, and all the Coppermans had endless hakaras hatov to him for doing that. He stopped them basically being put in an institution because he took over that father type role. So Rav Copperman was very bright from the beginning. He finished high school, I believe, at the age of 16. He skipped the classes a couple of times. Skipped in the sense of got upgraded, so to speak. And then he went to college, to Trinity College, which is a prestigious, as you can intuit, it's not a Jewish college, but and he got his degrees there, and he was done with that by the age of 20. All the while, because at the age of 20 he went to Gateshead, but he was already connected with Gateshead for the intervening years because Rav Dessler would be collecting for Gateshead Kollel, not for Gateshead Yeshiva. He wasn't connected to the Yeshiva, but that's how Rav Copperman knew of Gateshead through these visits. Rav Dessler would actually come to Ireland, as would the Ponevezher Rav. These 2 Gedolim he had early exposure to because they both came to Ireland collecting for their mostos, etc., and they both had a profound impact on him. So summer breaks, intersemester breaks, he was straight away in Gateshead, and he learned a lot. Also during his university time, he would shape his curriculum around his learning time, and somehow he still graduated with honors, etc. So in 1949, as he's 20 years old, in 1949, he went to Gateshead. I think he was there for a year. And Gateshead then was under Rav Nachman Landinsky. This was not yet the Rav Leib Gurowitz's time. This was still Rav Nachman Landinsky from Radin, who he remembered very fondly. And when he was in Gateshead, he was, I think, the only yeshiva bacher who was allowed to hear Rav Dessler's shmuzin. The yeshiva bacher were not allowed to hear Rav Dessler's shmuzin. It was considered a separate thing. He was with the Kollel and also the seminary, Gateshead seminary that Rav Dessler started. Rav Copperman was an exception to the rule, as he would go on to be exceptions to many rules. So he was there, I think, for about a year or so. And then he went to Israel and learned in Hebron Yeshiva for a couple of years. And that's when Rav Cheskel Sarna was there, and those Rebbeim. And even there, already, he was known as a kind of a unique entity. He would give a Gemara shir for the English speakers who found it difficult to follow the Hebrew. And he was there for a couple of years, until 1952. That's when he got smicha. He got smicha from Rav Herzog. And of course, he knew Rav Herzog from Ireland. Rav Herzog was the chief rabbi of Ireland in those early years. When he gets married in 1952 and then moved to Chicago. That's where his wife, the Rabbanit, Reb Zipporah Pinkus from home, she was from Chicago. And then they moved to Chicago for a few years to make money to be able to buy an apartment in Bayit Began. No one was giving them one. And they had to raise the money. So they were there for 4 years. And in Chicago, he taught, he did another degree, and he became very close to Rav Kreisworth there. Chaim Kreisworth was in Chicago in those 50s. And they finally had enough money. In 1956, that's when they were, in fact, when they got married. So the one who did the catering for their wedding was Mrs. Finkel, who was the mother of Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. She did catering. And she heard that they were in Chicago to be able to get money together to go and live in Israel. And she gave them dessert of the wedding on the house. She said, that's my contribution to your aliyah. So anyways, in 56, they come to Eretz Yisrael. They make aliyah. And they settled in a place called Bayit Began, which was out in the sticks in those days. It wasn't even, I don't know if it was part of Yerushalayim. It was one of those yeshuvs that in the fullness of time gets incorporated into Yerushalayim. Back in the day, that's where they wanted to be. And Rav Copperman starts teaching. In the first 7 or 8 years, he teaches in the yeshiva high school, where it's in current day Kiryat Noar, but which way it doesn't exist anymore, this high school, but he taught there. He was the principal there. And that's when he already starts his writing is already beginning in the late 50s. We'll talk about what he wrote then, maybe just a little bit when we discuss his publications. But there he is, and he's also teaching in a seminary at the time. By the time the early 60s come along, Rav Copperman is convinced that there is something missing in women's education, sorely deficient, and he needs to do something about it. I heard from one of his Chicago Talmidot that when he left Chicago in 1956, when they came to live in Israel, so the students begged him to stay in Chicago, and this woman told me that he said to her, I'd love to stay, but I can't, because I have a dream to open a college for women in Israel, and that's what I'm going to do, which was very interesting because it wouldn't happen until much, much later, and there were many other triggers and catalysts. But anyway, that's what she said. But come the early 60s, it's going to happen. And the background to Michlala, briefly, of course, there's a whole literature around it, it's a whole lore. But women's education was sorely deficient, as I said. The level that was expected, both from Kite and also of actual intellectual academic standards, was terribly low. And Rav Copperman witnesses firsthand because he taught in one of these existing institutions. It was also true that Beis Yaakov at that time was not an option. This was surprising for me, but Rav Copperman told me a number of times. In those late 50s and that time, Beis Yaakov was only for Hasidim. I mean, Litvaks did not send their daughters to Beis Yaakov. It was unheard of. So you had many Litvaks who would sooner send their daughter to university than to send them to Beis Yaakov, and that the results were not so great from that. So putting all this together, Rav Copperman realizes that the standard of teaching needs to be much, much higher, and to that end, he was still in his mid-30s, I think, He opened in 1964 Michlala, and that it grew and grew. People in America, if they know of Michlala, what they know of is the Chutz La'aretz branch of Michlala. But in the main, Michlala is an Israeli teacher training college. In the late 70s, I believe, or whenever it was, early 70s, they opened the Chutznik branch. But that is not the Michlala. It's, for us, it's Michlala, for the Chutznikim. But it's the Chutznik Machal, what's called Machleket Chutz La'aretz. And he remained head of Michlala till, I think, in the mid-90s. Then he retired officially, but he never disconnected from Michlala. He just retired officially. And he passed away, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. He was 85, 86 years old.
Okay, so that's his basic biography. There's more to get into. But so as you mentioned, Michlala, but he published a lot of Seforim, like I said. So let's talk about his publications, his Meshech Chochmah, his Seforim, and then he has this Pshuto Shel Mikra, which is what we'll focus on here a little bit. Just interestingly, by the way, on his Seforim, and I guess here I have the Pshuto Shel Mikra in front of me, he says Yehuda ben Avraham Simcha v'Sara Zlata Copperman. So he puts his mother's name as well. I guess that has to do with the story and his upbringing, his mother raising them. I assume that he has her name there as well. So how did he get into? I mean, this Pshuto Shel Mikra, I think, came later. Talk about what did he write first? What was he? What talk about his publications again? The Meshech Chochmah being the most famous, but what are his publications and what did he write first and later?
So interestingly, his first publications were none of the above. Not Meshech Chochmah, not Seforim, not Pshuto. But his first publications, which and I mentioned he started writing when he was still at the principal of that boys' school in the late 50s, were chavrot. He started publishing these booklets of sugyas. In other words, he would take a section of the Chomsh and turn it into a sugya, or more correctly, reveal that there was a sugya there. And it would be subdivided into sections, and it would progress, and he would be the MC, so to speak, of the Rishonim and Achronim as he would develop. And he must have done a couple of dozen of these booklets. He would take a topic like Zokin Mamre, or Edom Zomimim, or Pesach Sheni, or Baltosif, and start from the beginning, and he would envelop them from all sides, from the Parshanut side, from the Halacha side, from the Machshava side, and this really is what he would call the symphony of Torah, that symphony of those three things, Machshava, Halacha, and Parshanut. Those have since been republished in 3 volumes. I mean, he has a sefer called Parsha Shoftim. It's over 500 pages long, because it's a collection of his sugyas on Shoftim, and he has another 2 volumes as well. And some people see those sugyas as really the heart of his contribution, even though many people know him very well and don't actually know of them at all. But when he would teach in Michlala, he would teach those sugyas. And it was really a chiddush, a revelation to the girls. There's a sugya here. Right? Sugyas don't only exist in the Gemara, they exist in the Chumash also. That's the first thing he wrote, those sugyas. The next thing I would say is Meshech Chochmah. And that came about quite organically. I think he opened up the Meshech Chochmah. He liked it a lot. He published an extract, or like a sample, so to speak, of what he would do with it, or at least what he did with that piece, in one of these periodicals. It got a lot of acclaim, or got a lot very good feedback, and that kind of encouraged him to keep going. And it was a 10-year project, at least. This is Meshech Chochmah, I'm sure you're familiar with it, speaks in half sentences. He assumes you know the entire Torah and all of Tanakh, and you know all of the sugyas just to the point where he wants to then pick up from there. That's all assumed. And therefore it needs to be deciphered. Meshech Chochmah almost needs to be translated into Hebrew, let alone be translated into English. It just needs to be unpacked. And that was the painstaking and really rigorous work. It's just one person's, no computers. It's Rav Copperman, he had bechavrusas. But that took place over at least 10 years. He released the volumes one by one, and he continued to revisit and upgrade the Pirush and just to make it intelligible, because otherwise you have to be practically half a Meshech Chochmah even to read it. So he allowed what he called Laman Yarutz B'Hakori, in order that you should be able to go through it. So that's the Meshech Chochmah. And then I'll leave Pshuto, because Pshuto began earlier, but the famous, or the version that we have nowadays came later. So maybe we'll leave that till last. But the second thing that he's well known for, and I'm very heartened and gladdened that you said that he's famous in the yeshiva world for Meshech Chochmah. I think he'd be very happy to hear that, because Meshech Chochmah was an unknown sefer in his time. In the yeshiva world, you have to constantly introduce the Meshech Chochmah as the Or Sameach on the Chomsh. And he's very happy that it reaches a stage where you might actually need to introduce the Or Sameach as the Meshech Chochmah on the Rambam. So he was very, very heartened by that. But he also has a Pirush on the Sforno. And this Pirush on the Sforno, he began, I think, when he was 60 years old to write this Pirush. So that's also, I mean, he never really stopped. He was always doing something. I mean, that's the time when people start to think about their retirement. And he's thinking, can I do the Sforno? And he told me his motivation for the Sforno was that people don't really, the Sforno is so short and the print is so small, and he's in the Mikros Gedolos, right? Thanks to the Netziv, right? The Netziv wrote that letter telling them, the Mikros Gedolos publishers originally that, you will be putting the Sforno into the Mikros Gedolos. I don't know if they were going to, but they for sure did after that. But it's very brief again. It's over before you know it. And people tend to look at the Sforno almost like as an afterthought. They've done the hard work with Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, if they have. And then the Sforno, in Rav Copperman's words, and was the Sforno? Like, before we close the Mikros Gedolos, let's just kind of see the Sforno has anything to say. And because he writes so tersely, if you don't ponder it, you're likely to miss it. And he felt that was a disservice. And so he wrote the Sforno. He summed up actually He summed up the difference between his Pirush on the Meshech Chochmah and his Pirush on the Sforno. He said his Pirush on the Meshech Chochmah was Leman Yerutz B'Hakari, right? So in order you should be able to run through it and go through it. And his Pirush on the Sforno, he said, is Leman Lo Yerutz B'Hakari. You shouldn't just run through it, because otherwise you'll finish and you won't really know what's happening. That's a Sforno, which again has gone through a couple of editions. And that brings us to Pshuto Shel Mikra. Is that where we are? So that's
Yeah, I think that's where we are. And you mentioned the Meshech Chochmah. I think that's the story to Meir Simcha, right? He didn't want to print the Meshech Chochmah which he wrote first. He didn't want to be known as the Sefer Chomsh, so he did the Or Sameach first. As you mentioned. But in the yeshiva world, he is Rav Copperman is known for the Meshech Chochmah. As far as I always, I didn't really know much about him or Michlala. Growing up, going to yeshiva, we all knew Rav Copperman's Meshech Chochmah. I mean, nowadays there's other editions and his editions, but there was nothing. He was the Meshech Chochmah. It was a beautiful edition. Back before you had all these Mavur, all these Zvad, all these things on Chomsh Seforim, you had his Meshech Chochmah, and like you said, he really opened it up, and that was the Meshech Chochmah on the Sforno as well, which I think is not as well known. And then we get the Pshuto Shel Mikra, which is not nearly as well known, I think. I'm not sure. I was going to say, I don't know what would be his magnum opus, what he considered. I should ask you that. What did he consider of all the Seforim? But the Meshech Chochmah is the most well known. I will say that for sure, and that's for sure. The Pshuto Shel Mikra is not, but it's a fascinating work. So I'll let you discuss the Pshuto Shel Mikra. One thing I should mention before we get to Pshuto Shel Mikra, just as and his son is the one who put out the beautiful Hamek Davar, right? That's his son who did the Netziv's work on Chomsh. Is that his son or his grandson?
One of his sons. One of his sons. Yeah, he has 5 sons, and I think it's his 4th son or 3rd, Rav Mordechai, Moti Belaz, but Rav Mordechai, who's actually married to a descendant of the Netziv. He's married to a Shapira from the Shapira family, so they're close to the Netziv. But Rav Copperman, in any case, felt close to the Netziv for reasons that I hope to outline in when we come to Pshat. And therefore, Rav Mordechai, with a good bit of help from Rav Copperman himself, but Rav Mordechai did the Hamek Davar. Yeah. Yeah,
I just wanted to mention that's the black one. It's the 6 volumes, including the Rina Shel Torah and Shir Shirim. So that's a very just to mention that. Okay, so let's talk about Pshuto Shel Mikra, what it is and why he wrote it and how it came to be.
So that's very interesting. And in fact, how did it all start, Rav Copperman and Pshat? Where did it all begin? So interestingly, he told me that his interest in Pshat, not that he was at any time not interested, but his special ignited interest in Pshat, it came about through the Meshech Chochmah. So that's quite interesting. And the reason why is because he's going through these piece after piece of Meshech Chochmah, and in addition to doing the work of creating an edition that can be learned by Lomdim, he's also observing the Meshech Chochmah, and he began to discern an approach to Pshat, which he then became enamored with and fascinated with, and that started his trail on Pshuto Shel Mikra, which never really ended. So it started with the Meshech Chochmah, interestingly enough.
And I want to ask, but you mentioned how he got interested in Pshat. How did he define Pshat? I mean, this will come to the Sefer of Pshuto Shel Mikra, but how, there's always the question of defining Pshat. I mean, that's, you can just discuss generally in different shitas, but how, in his mind, when he said Pshat, Pshuto Shel Mikra, what did he mean by that? How did he view that?
Oh, he had a very set definition of what Pshat means. If I recall correctly, and I think I do, as far as Rav Copperman is concerned, Pshat is the meaning of the straightforward meaning of the pasuk based on the rules of syntax, grammar, and language. That's it. That's what Pshat is. Those three things: syntax, grammar, language, and grammar. And he used to chide the yeshiva bachrim, and I brought my Talmidim to him just to meet with him, once in a while. And he would tell them that, when you're learning Gemara and you say, what's Pshat and Rashi, what's Pshat and Tosfos, so that could be a misspeaking to us. So it's not entirely accurate, because what you don't mean to say, what is the meaning of their words based on syntax, language, and grammar? What you mean is, what's the deeper meaning behind it? What's the deeper understanding? So what you mean to say is, what's the Pirush? What's the Pirush or the Havana, etc. I don't think he changed anyone's way of speaking in that respect, but it was a question of that's what Pshat is, 100%.
And he says this right away. I mean, he opens up the Pshuto Shel Mikra. That's what he says. He says that's the Pirush, and he explains your example they gave in with Gemara and learning Rashi, and that's the first chapter. He talks about Shailas HaKetzad v'Shailas HaMadua, which we'll get into. The difference between Ketzad and Madua, and he explains that the difference between Pshat and Pirush.
Right. So, and I think maybe even here, there's. It's important to also give a bit of historical perspective. I think is very important, because he really came along at a very significant time in the world of Pshat. You might think this type of sefer you could have written at any time over the last 1,000 years. Well, you wouldn't have had the Acharonim in it, but or any time you could have written it. But there was a call of the time for this book, and the reason why for this work, it was also part of it, because Rav Copperman saw that what you could call, for want of a better term of expression, that both to the right and to the left of him, Pshat was being either neglected or abused. And what that means is, to begin with, the only place where Pshat was taken seriously as a discipline was really in the universities. But he held that to be a travesty, because there's no concept of kedusha there. It's dealt with it like a text, like any other text, and you could have people who are just with courses there, but they find it interesting and moreover, they have no room for Chazal within their worldview, because this is just the words. It's a pure text, etc. and so forth. So the only places where you'll see Pshat being studied is where it's being I don't know there's not a nice way to say it, but it's really being torn apart and desecrated effectively. So who are the frum people? So they're in yeshiva, but they're not learning Pshat, because they might learn Steinmaker with Rashi if they do good for them. They're not going to get a sense of Pshat through the Gemara, because the goal of the Gemara is not to tell you Pshat in the pasuk, and we'll get to that in the questions of Ketzad and Madua in just a second. So here's Rav Copperman, and he looks to his right and he looks to his left, and the Pshat is nowhere. And because people who claim it for their own are misusing it, and there are other people who don't even claim it for their own. And that's why he felt there was a call of the time to, and that's why the full title, if I remember correctly, of his Sefer Pshuto Shel Mikra, if you have it in front of you, it's got to be something like Al Mekomo Shel Pshuto Shel Mikra B'Shleimut B'Kedushat HaTorah B'Shleimuta, or is the other way around?
It's Pshuto Shel Mikra. Yeah, the subtitle is Al Mekomo Shel Pshuto Shel Mikra B'Shleimus HaTorah B'Kedushat. I'll say to my American.
So, yeah. So that's obviously you can't put all of that say that in one breath. So it became Pshuto Shel Mikra, but it's the full title. The role of Pshuto Shel Mikra, its place within the totality and sanctity of Torah. That's the goal.
And so that's the purpose that he had to write. Now, we mentioned before where he learned, and in his shaykhs to many gedolim, did he have a rebbe in Pshat in that sense? Or was this his unique approach that he got out of learning all the mefarshim and going through the sugyas of Chumash?
Rav Copperman was, I would say two things about Rav Copperman. Firstly, he was very independent-minded. And secondly, he had a connection. I think it's fair to say he kind of had a Rebbe Talmud connection with the Seforim that he learned. In other words, I don't think he had a Rebbe as a person for Pshat. I know that he studied Semitic languages and he knew Hebrew grammar very well. And he would always mention, Zachor Latov, his teachers in that respect, but he's going way beyond them. So the Gedolim that he was exposed to, I think this is correct, what I'm about to say, they were all role models for him. And from a certain point of view, they were all mentors for him, but they weren't rebbeim for him in the sense that, like, he didn't quote them often. It was normally one or two things that he quoted from each, which clearly had a massive impact. He quoted one or two things from Rav Dessler. Rav Dessler says that when something needs to be done and the person takes it upon himself to do it, that person gets a special siyata d'shmaya. That's something I guess that Rav Dessler, he heard directly from him. And that became a light for his, ner l'raglov, because that's exactly what he proceeded to do. And he even quotes Rav Dessler in that quotation in the beginning of some of his Seforim. So clearly he had unlimited reverence for the Panovich Rav and Rav Nachman Landinsky and Rabbi Cheskel Sarner and so on and so forth. But in terms of methodology, I think he got it directly from the Psukim, and in that respect, his rebbeim were the Meshech Chochmah, the Netziv, the Vilna Gaon, Rashi, Ramban, and Seforim.
Yeah, I mean, he goes through on the first, that first page, right in the open, he just gives a list of all different Mefarshei Tanakh. And one with this, it says that Keda is the philosophy, the Barbanel has his questions, the halacha of the Reved Azov, the pilpul of the Kli Chemda, the Chasidus of the Sfas Emes Neshem Shmuel, and he mentions the Ksava Kabbalah, he talks about Mubhak, he talks about the Malbim, he just lists all the different types, namely Melech, the Netziv, the Oznaim L'Torah, the Meshech Chochmah. What's fascinating is, and you can read the whole list if you have the Sefer. He just mentions everyone from Rishonim to Achronim to Chasidim to Litvaks to everybody. He just puts every little to German. He has every type of commentary in there. So he really had a connection to the Seforim. It's clear from reading his words. So let's talk a little bit about the Sefer. And he starts off with, let's expound a little more on the Shailas Madua and the Ketzad, right? Why versus how, I guess would be the way to say it. What does that mean, and how does he use that to explain his Mahalach and what he's looking to do?
So I think in order to, there's just one more thing we need to say before we get to Ketzad and Madua, and that is, this is probably the most famous statement from Chazal themselves about Pshat. Because Chazal talk about Pshat, they say it's more in Shabbos, Tafsam Gimel, Ein mikra yotzim midei Pshuto. Ein mikra yotzim midei Pshuto, which means the pasuk never ultimately or fully leaves its Pshat. So what Rav Copperman discusses really as a preface is, what does that mean? And he identified two main approaches to what the Chazal mean when they say Ein mikra yotzim midei Pshuto. So, and there's one that he identified with significantly, and the other he was very familiar with and appreciative of, but identified with less. You see, it's possible to say, because really what Chazal are saying, there's the Pshat, we've made our drushes, but Ein mikra yotzim midei Pshuto. So the first way to understand what they're saying is that there is what you think is the Pshat, what looks like the Pshat on a straightforward level. We're making these drushes, but you've got to know that even these drushes are not departing from the Pshat. Right? If that first approach is clear. In other words, everything that we have just said in the realm of Medrash Halacha, hasn't really departed from the Pshat. It's what you could call Emek HaPshat. Right? It's really just a more, if you only follow the Pshat through to a greater level of scrutiny, you'll see where we are coming from. That is the first approach to Ein mikra yotzim midei Pshuto. So in the end, the Pshat and the Drasha really are very close to each other, because the Pshat is what you could call Pshat 1.0, and the Drash is what you could call Pshat 2.0, but it's still Pshat. And proponents of that type of, generally, that approach are the Malbim, Rabbi Mecklenburg, and the Ksava Kabbalah. They're famous for doing that. And sometimes you really can see it. And to give you just a simple example, of what that type of approach is like, which is very easy to access. Lifnei iver lo sitein michshal. Lifnei iver lo sitein michshal, right? Or as what we say in English, lifnei iver. Okay. So the pasuk, if you should read it and translate it, don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind man. Couldn't be simpler. The Pshat is the Pshat, and that's that. As we know, Chazal come along and they give all sorts of other explanations as to what lifnei iver means. If you look in the Seforim, it means not to give a person bad advice. If you look in the Gemara, in Psachim, and elsewhere, Ezra and elsewhere, it's about don't give a person the wherewithal to do an Aveira, all sorts of everything. And whatever happened to the blind man who's kind of left, he's left standing there in the pasuk with a stumbling block and he's just waiting to, fall over, and we've completely gone somewhere else. So where is that coming from? But as Mefarshim explain, here, what we think is the Pshat might simply be a non-careful reading of the pasuk, because we say don't place a stumbling block in front of a blind man. But I think that's the respectable English translation. But the word for place in Hebrew is lasim, place, lasim. So the pasuk should have said lifnei iver lo tasim michshal, do not place a stumbling block. But it didn't say that. So that's an awkward situation when the pasuk didn't say what you thought it said, because it said lifnei iver lo titein michshal. But titein means don't give, but you don't give something for someone, you place something, and that's why Chazal say. So that's really why the pasuk is referring to something that he could stumble over, but it's something that you give him. Bad advice, the wherewithal to do an favor, so that's an example of you have what seems to be the Pshat, what seems to be the drash, but it's like a deeper level of Pshat, let's say. The second base medrash, what Rav Copperman would call the two-party medrash, never seeks to synonymize Pshat and drash at all. In other words, the Pshat is the Pshat, the drash is the drash, and they live side by side, but neither is meant to be taken as the other. And what's an example, by the way? And who are proponents of that type? Vilna Gaon, Netziv, Meshech Chochmah. And that represents that base of medrash. And the Ravit Hazav, who basically does all sorts of other things as well. And what's an example of the difference between these two schools? So let's take probably one of the classic Pshat Drash divides in the Chomsh. Ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. Okay, so what does that mean? So if you ask any child what it means, he'll tell you it means an eye for an eye. If you ask anyone who knows halacha or has learned Gemara, he'll tell you that it doesn't mean you put out his eye, but it means that he has to pay the value of his eye, and that's the halacha. So now the important question is, so what are you meant to claim that the Pshat is? In other words, I know the halacha, I know what the Gemara says, but at the end of the day, what am I meant to conclude? That the words ayin tachas ayin, what do those three words mean? So if you take the first approach, and there are those who do, through various intricate means or involved means, you will actually come out concluding that ayin tachas ayin really means money. It doesn't mean really on a Pshat level an eye for an eye, actually, literally. But if you take the second base of medrash approach, Meshech Chochmah and others, ayin tachas ayin, it means an eye for an eye. Now the halacha is not in accordance with that Pshat meaning, but that doesn't mean that those words don't mean that, and it doesn't mean that it wasn't meant to be written that way, which will then lead us to then ask the question: well, if the halacha is different than the Pshat, so then why is it written that way, and what do I learn? So that's a classic. So, and that leads us to the question of finally, Shelat HaKetzad and Shelat HaMadua, the question of how and the question of why. And really, you could say the question of how is the Gemara's domain. The Gemara deals almost exclusively with the question of how. And by how we mean, how do you know that this is the halacha given what the pasuk says? If the pasuk says ayin tachas ayin, how do you know that that means money? And if you look in Bava Kama and Daf, wherever it is, Pei Gimel, Pei Daled, so you'll see the Gemara explains at length why, with the basis of what it concludes that ayin tachas ayin translates practically into money. The Gemara explains at length how it knows that. But then there's a follow-up question, namely, why? Why what? So why do you write it in a way that doesn't sound like that? In other words, but you see how this is based a lot on the second approach, that the Pshat really is an eye for an eye. It means the Pshat is an eye. Now you've explained how you've concluded that practically it's money. That's the how. But that leaves you with a question. So then why did you write an eye for an eye? If the halacha is not going to be, why not simply write compensation for an eye for an eye? And then your answer to that question, which is not going to be discussed in the Gemara, it's going to be discussed in whoever discusses it, will lead you to one of the other Torah messages that you get from Pshat when you're not getting halacha from the Pshat. That's the follow-up question of why did it write? What else is there for me to learn about this beyond the halacha? Just another example, just to concretize the another cause célèbre of what you could call Pshat and literal, etc. Mimachras HaShabbos, Mimachras HaShabbos, Mimachrat HaShabbat, when the Omer is brought. So what does Mimachras HaShabbos mean? It looks like it means the day after Shabbos, which we call Sunday. And of course, the Tzedekah are famous for saying that. But we know, we have a tradition, we have a Kabbalah, Masorah, that it means the day after the first day of Pesach, the morrow of the first day of Pesach. How do you know that? However you know it. Okay, consult the Gemara in Menachos, where it's or Daf Samachay, and it will work it all out. And these were ongoing debates and disputations. How do you know that Machras HaShabbos means the second day of Pesach? But once again, that's Shelat HaKetzah. How do you know? But when the Gemara is finished, you're left with a follow-up question. No, so why? Why did the Torah write Mimachras HaShabbos if its intention is, assuming that there was a clearer way to write this to indicate the second day of Pesach, then why did it write Mimachras HaShabbos? And the answer will be something about. It's teaching you something about the first day of Pesach through the word Shabbos, which is beyond the halakha.
And talking about Ayin Tachas Ayin and other ones, this is what Rav Copperman goes through in the Sefer. So besides,
sorry, Rav Nachman, before let me just. I'm a Maggid Shir. That means I will speak for an hour unless you stop me. So I hope I haven't been speaking too much. Or
no, I think it's good. I hope so. Hope the listeners are enjoying it. I think it's fine. Not a problem. I'll jump in if I feel the need to. But
perfect. Doesn't stop anyone else.
So Rav Copperman really goes through a lot of this. This is really what the Sefer Pshuto Shel Mikra is. What you've been discussing is a very, very shortened version of what the Sefer is. And Rav Copperman, let's say Ayin Tachas Ayin, he goes through examples, not only what you said, he goes through the Seforim and the Ben Ezra and the Ramban, he goes through the Pshatim that they're going to have, and he explains this in depth as well. There's a lot more in here. What else? He goes to Pshuto Shel Mikra, Malamed Lachal Lamaisa, Pshuto Shel Mikra Malamed is Zarotzi Bovadei Raisa, Vashem Mechai Betunai Misyam D'Rabbanan. He talks about all the aspects of Pshuto Shel Mikra. Are there any other particular parts that you want to highlight? Of course, and we'll get to what you did in your English adaptation of the Sefer, but from the main Chibur in the Hebrew, any other particular points that we should bring in?
Sure. So, and I think each one deserves maybe a sentence or two with examples if applicable, because at the core, just to pick up where we left off, at the core of this question of what is the Pshat teaching me if it's not teaching me the halacha? Because as Rav Copperman always used to say, even when the Pshat isn't teaching me halacha, it's still teaching me Torah. So that led Rav Copperman to develop over the course of many years what he called functions of Pshat, meaning things the Pshat can be doing when it's not in accord with the halacha. And he came up with, I believe, 11 different functions of Pshat. And they are, for example, sometimes the Pshat isn't, if it's not teaching you the halacha, it's teaching you an ethical lesson. And that, based on the Rambam and Seforim and others, is how he explained Ayin Tachas Ayin. As if to say, this should happen to you. How can you knock someone's eye out? This should happen to you. But practically it won't. But don't forget that a person is not an object. It's not just, if your bank account is in order, you can basically do whatever you want to the person next to you. So that's a Musar lesson by phrasing it in terms of Ayin Tachas Ayin. The Pshat can even teach you the halacha sometimes. Sometimes the Pshat, even if it doesn't teach you the halacha as we have it on an ongoing basis, but it can reflect the halacha as it was in that initial time for various reasons that may have been. That's what's called halacha l'sha'ah. which many Mefarshim talk about. It can even teach you ongoing halacha, which is alongside the halacha as we know it. And a classic example of that is in this week's parsha. The pasuk says, "Lo yumsu avos abonim, ubonim lo yumsu alav anavosa." Parents shouldn't die for the children should die on account of the parents. Now, the Gemara in Sanhedrin learns from here that family members can't be adim for each other; they can't testify for each other, which means that parents can't die on account of the sons and vice versa. But the pshat would seem to be that they won't die because of them. The sons won't die because of the averos, but the halacha doesn't seem to be that way. And yet, in Sefer Melachim, there's a famous case of one of the kings, Amatzia, who people tried to kill him, and those who tried to kill him, he had them killed. But he did not kill their children, even though strategically it's probably a good idea. I mean, the children of people that you killed tend to grow up and want to kill you back. But the pasuk says he didn't do it, as it says in the Torah, Sefer Torah's Moshe, Lo yumsu avos abonim. So you actually have a pasuk there which describes the pshat as the basis of the halacha of actually not killing children on account of something their parents did wrong. But that's not like the Gemara. So you have these two alongside the Gemara. And there's all sorts of other things that pshat can teach you. In fact, sometimes the pshat can even teach you Kabbalah, which is for us unusual because we think of Kabbalah as being the most esoteric and most removed from the grounded meaning. But again, an example from this week's parsha, Yibum, where the pasuk says that the brother she marries the brother. V'haya ahabechor asher teled yakum Hashem aviv. Achiv. So the bechor, he will then take the place. Now the Gemara in Yevamos in Daf Kaf Daled famously says the pasuk sounds like it's saying that the son should be called after the deceased father, but the Gemara says no. What the halacha means is that the oldest brother should do yibum. It's talking about the brother doing yibum, not the son that will be born, which is a major upheaval. The halacha doesn't seem to be like the pshat. And once again, you can either say that is the pshat in the pasuk, or you can ask, so why does the pasuk say this? And the Ramban says it says it to tell you that this is that the soul of the deceased brother is coming back through the son. That's a Kabbalah idea, and that's the pshat in the pasuk. So the pshat can do all sorts of things, from ethics to Kabbalah, halacha l'shah, halacha l'doros. Those were the 11 functions of pshat, and it just opens up the whole world of Pshuto Shel Mikra in that way.
So that really is the bulk of the much more the first volume of the set to come to 3-volume set. That's really almost 400 pages. Now, what was and I'll just mention already here. The second volume really deals with iyunim. He goes in depth into various mefarshim. Peshat Rishonim. He goes iyunim Pirush Rashi al Torah, Rashbam, Ramban. Then he goes to Achronim, the Sfarno, the Gur Aryeh, Meshech Chochmah, etc. And then there's some other things as well. Then he goes to some iyunim b'mikra. That's really what he's doing in the second volume. And there's a lot. Again, another to give a feeling, it's over 400 pages, almost 450 pages. The second volume. What was Rav Copperman looking to do with these volumes? Were these, we didn't really talk about the writing. First of all, the way it came to be, were these written as essays and then ended up being compiling into a sefer later? Was it written as a sefer? And in general, what was he looking to do with the sefer? Just to was this something he was looking for himself and how to teach, and what he was teaching in Michlala, where he was teaching others, or was this something that he was trying to impact? He wanted people to understand when they're learning Chomsh.
So certainly, I believe he had an eye. He had an eye on the readers. He wanted to spread this message, whatever it may be. There were certain mefarshim where it could be that he felt that people didn't fully appreciate them or didn't fully really get what they were doing, and therefore he felt it was important to discuss it in an organized way. There were other mefarshim where he felt that people abused really what those mefarshim were doing, and probably the classic case is the Rashbam, who has a chapter on the Rashbam, because there's many people who see themselves as flying the flag of the Rashbam by ignoring Chazal and just focusing on the Pshat. By the way, parenthetically, and this is also important, because a lot of people are fans of Pshat without actually knowing what Pshat is. Just back to the definition of Pshat, and by which I mean they know that there's midos of drash. I mean, they know there's parameters for drash. But because Pshat is often translated as the simple meaning, for many people that translates practically into simply the first thing that comes into their head. And they call that the Pshat. So no wonder they love Pshat. It's that easy, and they can say what they want. So it's also important to realize that Pshat has rules, and it's not the first thing you think of. It's also probably not the second thing. You need to learn it. So that's but back to Rashbam, where it was very pronounced, because the Rashbam you see is only Pshat. And by the way, I think it's in place to mention something else with regards to Pshat. Rashi has been sidelined again without making reference to other works called Pshuto Shel Mikra, lahavdil, but Rashi has been sidelined as not being a Pshat Pirush. And that is an oversimplification of what Rashi himself said that he was intending to do. But by which we mean, when you talk about Pshat, and back to the rules of Pshat and the world of Pshat, there's Pshat explanations and there's Pshat issues. They're not the same. In other words, a Pshat explanation will always have to answer to those three things: language, syntax, and grammar. Otherwise, it's not a Pshat explanation. But there's another issue of Pshat, and that is what begs a question? What raises a problem? And here, when we ask the question, is Rashi a Pshat Pirush or not? So the important follow-up is, what do you mean? Do you mean in terms of the explanations that he gives, or the issues that he addresses? In other words, in terms of the explanations that he gives, Rashi himself says he will ideally use Pshat, but will take recourse to Agada if necessary. But Rashi is a Pshat Pirush because he only ever addresses anomalies within the Pshat. It needs to be a Pshat issue to get him going, to get him asking the question. How will he respond? With Pshat ideally, and with Drash. So if you see Rashi bring in an Agada, so you need to know how to relate to that in terms of what we call Rashi being a Pshat Pirush. It is true at the same time that different Mefarshim might be divided as to whether something constitutes a Pshat issue or not. That's also, in other words, that's not that everyone agrees what's a Pshat question, they just disagree what's the Pshat answer. There could be disagreements as to what makes for a Pshat question. And a classic example of that is the angels going up and down, right? In Yaakov's ladder. And if you look in Rashi, and this is one of the cases, you don't have to work out what was bothering Rashi. He tells you. Rashi says, first going up, then coming down. What does that mean? Malachim start in heaven. It should have been Yordim Va'olim. And Rashi sees that as a problem, and as a Pshat problem. Now, his answer is not a Pshat answer, because the answer is there are different groups of Malachim. I mean, how can the Pshat tell you that? But if you look in Rashbam, he has an amazing comment on those words. Olim v'yordim bo, says Rashbam, al derech hapshat ein ledaktik. On the Pshat level, one doesn't have to worry too much about this. Up and down, down and up. The tachlis, they're going up and down. I mean, the meaning is clear. So that's very interesting, because it's an example of where Rashi and Rashbam, they're not even asking what the Pshat is, but rather, is there a Pshat issue here that needs to be responded to? In any case, Rashbam himself explicitly says that the reason why he wrote his Pirush on Al Derech HaPshat is because everyone was involved in the drashos of Chazal, which are the Iker, those are his words, which are the Iker, and he felt that the Pshat was neglected, and it shouldn't be neglected. That's very far away from saying that the only thing Rashbam was interested in is Pshat, and he had no time for Chazal. You've seen his Pirush on Bava Basra, he found time, plenty of.
Yeah, he's quite extensive on Bava Basra.
His Pirush on Bava Basra has got to be longer than his Pirush on the whole Torah, maybe a few times over.
Yeah, especially we don't have the whole commentary on the Torah, but even what he would have, what he wrote, the commentary on the Torah is not that big. Exactly. It's very, very, very different. Now, one other thing as well to ask you, so in the Pshuto Shel Mikra, which I was able to get a set, you helped out through Michlala. I think it's available. I'll try to find out before this podcast is up. So if it's available, that the listeners can somehow purchase this the set of Pshuto Shel Mikra in the Hebrew before we get to discussing your English. So I'll try to find that out, and if there's information, I'll put it in the show's notes. So look there. But there's also comes the Mavoi Lelimud Torah, small, thin volume. What's that about?
Well, once again, I mean, it was impossible to go through Chumash in the way they did with all the Mefarshim without noticing patterns and seeing pathways and seeing certain principles that came out, which then formed what he felt was important preface to learning Torah. I mean, if you look through the, I don't have offhand, I don't you have in front of you the Mahor with the things that.
Yeah, I have it in front of me.
So,
yeah, I mean, he goes through. I mean, the last part in here, the Maimer, it's 3 Maimerim. The last Maimer, just going backwards, is Pshuto Shel Mikra. So he goes through. That's the last Maimer. He goes through this again. The first one, the middle one, Maimer Sheni, is Maimer Har Sinai, and then the first one is Shalosh Symphoniot. I guess that's symphonies. Symphony. That sounds like a great word. I'm looking at it.
That's right. It's not arteries. It's
yeah. So he goes through a bunch of things in there. So that it's just another. This volume is 150 pages. So that's that. Now let's talk a little bit about your English adaptation. So again, if I find the information, I'll put that. Your English information, the English one is available. I'll definitely put a link in the show notes. So that is available in Seforim store. That's 2 volumes. You did it through Mosaic Press, Pshuto Shel Mikra. Why the decision? Whose idea was it to adapt it into English? And then what was that adaptation like? What do you do exactly? And also, you put it a parsha, like a parsha Shavua, which is the original one is just a work of essays essentially put together. Or it's just not a work of essays put together, but it's a major work. This is you did it. So talk about your English adaptation.
So the background to the English is basically the fact that it's an interesting thing. If you're exposed to the world of Pshuto Shel Mikra, as anyone who had the fortune to be, to encounter Rav Copperman was, and by the way, just to mention, the impact, Rav Copperman's impact on the Torah world. So as a yeshiva bacher, if you know the Meshech Chochmah, so then you're impacted in that way. But in terms of his views on Pshat and his views on, and I would mention also parenthetically, a core part of Pshat learning, as far as Rav Copperman was concerned, was a correct appreciation of the personalities involved, meaning a correct reverence and regard. Because once again, in academic circles, it's everyone's fair game, and you can be talking about someone and discussing your own childhood, basically, because there's no notion that these were people who were on an elevated level. But that was part and parcel of Pshat, because how can you get the Pshat message? And this is one of Rav Copperman's famous, Rav Coppermanisms, is that people often ask, Ma Pshat, what's the Pshat? But that's not enough. Rav Copperman said, you have to ask, Ma Pshat melamed, what is the Pshat teaching me? And if you have no notion of who you're dealing with, how can you get the appropriate lesson from the Pshat? So that's also an important part of Pshat. Because Michlala was a teacher training college, and thousands of teachers have been trained by Rav Copperman, and they in turn go on to teach, that is where you have a massive area of impact from Rav Copperman. I don't know all those students will learn his Seforim, but they'll hear his Torah from their teachers who were his students. So coming to the English translation, I met a lot of people who were, I would say, quite learned, and certainly Yodei Sefer, who had no idea about Pshat. Like they had no concept that there was a world out there called Pshat, or that even there was anything out there called Pshat. Nothing beyond what you could put in 1 or 2 sentences. And that really planted the seed for me, or sparked the idea that maybe it should be available in English. So I thought this from time to time. It actually happens to be that the only time that I broached the topic with Rav Copperman himself was actually just a few days before he passed away. It was the last time that I saw him. And I felt I've got to ask him. I've got to just see what he thinks about this. So you may recall I mentioned before that Rav Copperman was always doing things. So when I said I think maybe Pshuto Shel Mikra should be in English, he thought that I was suggesting that he should translate it into English. And he started to tell me, well, I'm a little busy right now. This is 4 days before he passed away. But I told him no. I mean, I would offer to do it. And so he said he thought it was a good idea. He gave his blessing. He gave his bracha. It was very encouraging for the idea. So the difference between the Pshuto Shel Mikra that you described and what I did, actually, there's a missing link, which perhaps I'm remiss. I should have also mentioned this for fuller disclosure. there was another version of Pshuto Shel Mikra that Rav Copperman himself wrote. Because the way that you described the original Pshuto Shel Mikra was actually very kind and understated. In other words, it's very tough going, right? It's pages and pages, footnotes everywhere. The conversation isn't over until it's over, or until you're over. And it really takes a lot of, Rav Copperman realized that people would not necessarily be able to hold with the topic through such a discourse. I mean, there can be proof upon proof and keep on going, keep on developing. So he himself wrote a simplified version of Pshuto Shel Mikra, and it's almost like the antidote. It's like the therapy to the original Pshuto Shel Mikra, and it's called Kedushas Pshuto Shel Mikra, and he put it I'll say the haparshas, and every one is just a few pages long, maybe 3 or 4 pages long, 5 or 6. There's no footnotes, right? Not a footnote to be seen. It's literally the simplified version of Pshuto Shel Mikra. So from my vantage point, putting that into English, it was very clear that that's the one that needs to be translated into English. So it's not a direct adaptation from the original Pshuto. It's actually more of an ongoing translation, still adaptation of the simplified version of Pshuto Shel Mikra.
Is that simplified one, the Kedushas Pshuto Shel Mikra, is that available? Is that one available? Because it's funny. I know of this one. This is the one they sent me, and I looked at it, a little bit to prepare, not super extensive, and it's a serious scholarly work. I mean, you really need to sit and spend a lot of time with it. I didn't want to make it. I wasn't trying to make it sound simple. I mean, it's like you said, the 3-volume is a real work. It's not something, like you said, it's footnotes and he's going through these proofs and he's showing you exactly what he's doing. So it's not a light read. You don't just read it Shabbos afternoon on the couch. Not for that. Totally not for that. So yes, is the Kedushas Pshuto Shel Mikra, is that, do you happen to know?
I think it is. It's if it's not available, it's more easily available. And the reason why is because the simplified version of Pshuto was published by Masada Rav Kook.
Right, so I think it's not. So now, actually, I'm going to check. I think it's actually not. Right, so I remember when someone suggested the Sefer or the podcast episode a while ago, I think, or maybe just in general, I heard about the Sefer. I don't even remember. I heard it was Masada Rav Kook. That I think is not in print. Actually, I'm going to look. I don't think it is in print. But then the Pshuto Shel Mikra, the Michlala one, is just not around. It seems like hopefully it is available. It's in print if someone wants to get it. I think the Masada Rav Kook one is not in print, actually.
Well, but at least they could be contacted, and as if to say, if it's enough demand, maybe to print again. But either way, it was published to Masada Rav Kook. So the English edition is really, it's a translation, but even then, it is an adaptation, even of the simplified version.
So it's not just a straight translation.
No, Rav Copperman had a very interesting way of writing and a very interesting way of presenting, which you've seen. It's also kind of kaleidoscopic sometimes, the way that he kind of says everything at once, because he also has high expectations of his readers. And if I was already translating, I made sure to order things in a way. If Rav Copperman is talking to you, he can talk in that way, and you know exactly what he means. But as a sefer, certain things needed to be reordered, certain things, and the family, I'm very grateful to them that they actually gave me license to change whatever I wanted. Meaning, I never made a major change without consulting with them. This son, Rav Mordechai, who did the Hamek Dover, I was in touch with him regularly. We used to meet late at night, and we would go through my Pshuto questions, etc. But they let me rework things. If you read the Hebrew and the English, you'll see there's certain differences.
Right. Just by the way, as we're talking, I went and downloaded the catalog of Masada Rav Kook, and it's not in the catalog. As far as I know, it's not in print, and it hasn't been for a while. The Kedushas Pshuto Shel Mikra. So maybe the family wants to have them reprinted. I don't know, go to Masada Rav Kook or something, because and a listener could correct me. As far as I know, I've never seen it, and it's not on their catalog. It's not on their website. I don't think it's available. But I'll find out about the 3-volume, the main one, and your English adaptation is available. So I'll link to that as well. Let's just finish up. Mention your Seforim, your books that you.
I will say I'm only stopping talking about Rav Copperman because it's time to move on. By which I mean I would happily talk about Rav Copperman all day. and we haven't even spoken about his personality, and obviously this is more about the Sefer, but his midos and his refinement and his humility and his kindness and all of these things, it all goes together, especially because Rav Copperman himself maintained that the goal of Torah learning is to be translated into Torah living. And there was no better example than him. But if you drag me away from the topic of Rav Copperman, I'm being dragged away.
Listen, we can sit there forever, and really, while I'm recording this to you, I'm thinking we really could do an episode on the Meshech Chochmah and his edition, the Meshech Chochmah alone, and there's so much more to talk about with him and Pshuto Shel Mikra. We really didn't even, the expression, like the tip of the iceberg. We didn't even get to the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's so much in there to discuss, and the examples and what he goes through, and just there's so much more there. So yes, we can just keep going, but there's a podcast. If there's more interest on a specific, I could say like this, I'll put it out to listeners. I don't know if you're willing, or Bernstein, but if there's a specific, people are familiar with the Pshuto Shel Mikra, I'm sure there are specific chapters. There's endless. We can do episodes and episodes and episodes on all the different parts. So there's so much more to talk about. If anyone's interested, just email me. Let me know if they want to hear more about, specific and Yonam things he talks about. But let's just mention here, like I said in the beginning, we really should do an episode together separately on your Seforim. But once we're here, just mention, just briefly tell listeners a little bit about your Seforim, just so they can know, just to hear a little bit about what you've done, because you've written a lot of Seforim yourself.
Mm. So my first couple of Seforim are actually in Hebrew, one on the Chomsh and one on Meshech Chochmah. But after that, I moved to start writing in English. So my first book, which was published privately, is called Journeys in Talmud, which is actually a guide. It takes 22 sugyas and walks you through the mahalach of the sugya from its roots until halachic applications. So that was the first one on sugyas. Every English book I've done since then has been published with Mosaic Press. So I've done a few on the Moadim. I think by this stage, each of the Moadim has a sefer. Started with the Haggadah, Purim, Shavuos, etc., Hanukkah. Seasonally, there's a Tshuva sefer, the white Tshuva sefer called Tshuva. That's for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And actually, just a week ago, I published a sefer on Sukkot. It's called the Symphony of Joy. So those are the Moadim Seforim, and the goal is people are looking as a Yom Tov comes along to connect with the Yom Tov. They're searching. I know I was, and my sense was that people were. So it draws on many, many different mefarshim to bring together discussions to allow for such a connection and so on. I wrote a sefer called Agoda, which is on Agadata. It takes 18 Agodas, 18 principles or fundamentals of Hashkafa, of Judaism, and works them up through Agoda to develop them. And I wrote 2 volumes on the Chomsh, actually, called Dimensions in the Chomsh. That came out last year. They're quite gesunte volumes, about 550 pages each. Which is the product of 20 years of Chumsh Yirim that I've been given. And then the projects to come is actually, I'm working at the moment on a booklet, actually, not a book, a booklet, a Siddur companion called Moments and Meanings. Just to highlight certain moments. I think people are looking again for moments in davening. If you go for the whole thing, you might get a little bit frustrated or confused. But it isolates about 50 or so moments in the daily or weekly davening, a couple of pages on each to give those connectors. And what's kind of on the horizon, and has been on the horizon for a while, is actually an English adaptation of Meshech Chochmah.
I was about to ask you that. Is there any plans for that? Because I'm shocked it hasn't been done with the Meshech Chochmah generally, and with Rav Copperman's extensive notes and commentary. So something like that really so I should ask you that. Is it just going to be Meshech Chochmah, or are you going to incorporate the notes and the comments of Rav Copperman as well?
It's impossible to just do the Meshech Chochmah, because if you just do that, then people will be as confused in English as everyone was in the Hebrew. So there is no such thing as just the Meshech Chochmah, I don't think. Someone has to help you. So I've been through Rav Copperman's commentary. I have the other commentary also. For triangulation purposes, I kind of use the 2 of them. It will be more organic as a write-up. So it won't be the terse text of half sentences on top and then the mound of commentary underneath. But it will be woven into the text itself. Will be all the background you need and all the etc. And it will also be a few pieces each. I mean, to do the whole thing. Firstly, there's many, many parts of Meshech Chochmah that people don't really have that much Zechus to, unless they're Talmid Chachamim. I don't think. If you do the whole thing, it would be at least 10 volumes.
Right. Okay.
It would be less than that.
Sounds good. So looking forward to that. I'll link to some of your books or your Seforim as well. And also I can try to link to if the Meshech Chochmah and the Seforim, but definitely Meshech Chochmah should be available in Seforim stores. But if I find, I'll try to find the link and put it in for both. Because like I said, Pshuto Shel Mikra, if I find out, I'll try to put the information. It should be available. I'll try to find that out. But the Meshech Chochmah and the Seforim are available in Seforim stores. So if anyone's interested in Rav Copperman's edition of those, if anyone is interested in checking those out. And again, like I said, if listeners want to hear more about the Pshuto Shel Mikra sugyas that we didn't get into, now that we did an episode on Rav Copperman's bio, if we should do specific inyanim, specific sugyas, we can maybe, if you're willing to do that again. So just email me, seforumchatter@gmail.com, and let me know. Thank you, Rav Bernstein, for joining me.
Pleasure, and it'll be a pleasure to join in future occasions for Rav Copperman and other matters as far and it should go Michlala, and it should be Zechus for bracha v'atzlacha.
Amen. Thank you.